Thank you. I'm Arron Gill. I'm a lecturer in perioperative care at Edge Hill University. I'm going to talk today about simulation in education in robotic surgery. Most of this presentation comes from my involvement with the study with Rebecca. I'll give you a bit of background to that, but these are just some of my observations. The reason why I've put simulation and education, it's obviously a key topic. Education has come up quite a number of times throughout the day. And part of that was I undertook a simulation within practice. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about that. That was part of my master's. And we'll go through, but hopefully this should add to the debate and raise more debate. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, how I got involved with the study, a little bit about current simulation training, a bit about robotic education, Fidelity and Authenticity specifically within simulation and robotic surgery. I think that's a really key topic. My initial simulation, so I undertook a master's module for simulation in robotic surgery, and then I developed that further to undertake more simulations specifically at one site within my team. And then obviously some future considerations, which again most people have been speaking about. So just a bit about my background. I'm an operating department practitioner by background. I worked within the team that you saw there. I've worked alongside some people within the room, generally within colorectal surgery and a little bit in urology. I've been involved in robotic surgery, so it's really interesting to see obviously the different views of the different practitioners and the different perspectives of everybody within the room. I was asked by Rebecca, I think I were a bit cheeky actually, I think one of my colleagues was going on maternity and I asked if I could be involved in the project quite early on. And Rebecca said that would be okay. So I primarily sort of worked at the sort of camera, looking at the camera and how we could film in theatres to help gain the sort of information that we needed for the project, and that snowballed significantly. I got more involved, became sort of part of the team, and then that led to some of my research that I'm going to explain about. Obviously, as we've seen throughout today, that there's a major focus on the surgical learning curve and less focus on the sort of team training. And obviously the differences between laparoscopic and open surgery, which again have been pointed out, put a lot of emphasis on the teamwork and the reactions to the team. And there's a number of observations that I saw within some of my simulations that usually when I presented this at the University of Leeds, and someone came up to me and says, I never even thought of that. So there's a number of things that hopefully will come up about that. Obviously, your surgeon's removed from the surgical field, they're not sterile, there's a lot of implications there. There's the bulk of the robot's overarching the patient. There's potential that we need to remove that in sort of emergency situations. And that's what initially sort of got me thinking about emergency situations, because with that removal of the surgeon, the team has got a lot of responsibility there, and it all depends on the experience and the skill mix of that team around that patient at the time. And obviously this led into my thoughts on simulation. I think the robot provides an excellent platform for simulation. But then obviously I've moved into education as a lecturer now. And I think there's a lot to be said about that, again, as the discussions have developed today. So current simulation training, again, as has been pointed out, there's very little that's been done in robotic surgery for simulation. I think what's very apparent speaking to people around the room is that there's a lot of different sites doing their own thing. They're all getting involved in simulation and everybody's doing it, but it's very fragmented, and no one's talking to each other than on platforms such as this. So I think it's really good to see, but actually any publication-wise from robotic surgery simulation, there's not been a lot. This study in 2011 was undertaken, and it sort of formed the basis of my simulation. So it looked at de-docking speeds, it looked at repositioning the patient, and it looked at attaching a defibrillation pad in an emergency situation. And they undertook this with the team. It was a very sort of simple undertaking, and it was published in the sort of the back of a journal, which took me a lot of time to find. I think you were involved. So it's evaluated extremely well from a realistic expectation of the scrub team. They said it evaluated really well. The times, the dedocking times and the time to access the patient reduced. So it was 2 minutes pre-simulation, and the second simulation round they undertook, it was 52 seconds. So a significant increase there. But again, it's a small scale, and not many people are developing these. I thought someone said something, sorry. So I undertook a one-off simulation as part of my master's project. That was a simulation module, and I undertook it as part of, to see where we could generate something similar based on the study above. And then I further developed that into a master's project to do 6 simulations within that. And obviously there's a lot of further examination required within simulation, but within education as well. I'm not trying to say that simulation is the best way forward. I'm not saying it's the worst thing that we can do. There's a lot of areas that we still need to look at specifically with regards to robotic surgery and robotic surgery simulation. I'm going to talk a little bit about robotic education, because that seems to be a real downfall of robotic surgery at the moment, as Rebecca's outlined within a study. There's no sort of cohesion with the teams, with the surgeons. Everybody's doing their own thing, and there's a threefold collaboration evident, or there should be, between education, the trust, and the manufacturer. And again, I think these are fragmented. So there's elements that are not being undertaken correctly or properly. And when we think about the implications of robotic surgery, from my perspective as a lecturer, as my students are going out into practice, the only thing that I deliver to them is a very brief lecture on robotic surgery. And that's because I'm interested in robotic surgery. It's not ingrained within the curriculum, it's not undertaken in many places, and it's a brief overview about what robotic surgery is, what you can expect when you walk into a robotic theatre. There's very little about the implications. There's no sort of elements of human factors that can be placed in there, and students get very different experiences in practice. They may experience robotic surgery over the 3 years in their degree, but they may not. And then you send somebody out, and quite like we've seen, they enter into a team that undertakes robotic surgery, and as the new member of staff, they're encouraged to get involved, but don't necessarily know what they're doing, and there's no formal training package there. From a trust perspective, and again, Rebecca's study has obviously outlined the different approaches to education. My experience was a top-down sort of, we send one member of staff to Strasbourg and they come and feed back to the rest of the team, and that filters down. And from a practice perspective, if they misunderstand or misinterpret any elements of that whilst off during training, that gets passed on to every single member of that robotic team. And then until you come to something like this, you don't realise that you're doing it wrong, and you've been doing it wrong for however many years. So I think that's an element that needs examining, and usually it's sort of put into an audit morning, which means that anaesthetists and surgeons have all got other responsibilities, and you get a few members of staff from the surgical team who turn up and get a lecture, which have obviously been well known to. You can't gauge how much learning is undertaken within a lecture, so there's no interaction, and it ends up being learning on the job, and the mistakes you make you sort of reflect on as a practitioner individually. The manufacturer. I think this is an extremely important element, and I'll go through some of my research, what I've done, but one of the major things that I found difficult was accessing the robot. Surgeons use the robot on a regular basis, and the only time you can get hold of it is on an audit morning, when the surgeons aren't available and the anaesthetists aren't available, so you can't do any multidisciplinary work and you can't collaborate. So from a manufacturer point of view, and I think this is a really important point for anyone who is introducing robotic surgery, there needs to be some sort of training element, or a robotic trainer. I understand that each trust has its own robots, they're difficult to access, but to put on a training day in London, somewhere where we can gain access to a robot that you can actually touch and move the arms and gain that experience. Because what I've found is that the manufacturers come in to train the surgeons on the simulator, and they use your robot within your theatre. at a time which is usually inconvenient, which is usually at the end of your list when you're trying to clean up and get everything sorted out. So I think there needs to be some consideration that if you're going to introduce a robotic program into a country, or you're a manufacturer of a robot, then there needs to be some element of area where you can go and train practitioners or invite them to undertake that practice and that education off-site where they can get to a convenient time. And that's what point I wanted to try and make there. I didn't realise that was there, sorry. But just finding that time to undertake simulation. Obviously everybody's got different timetables, everybody's got different agendas and different responsibilities. I'm going to move on to fidelity and authenticity, and this is specifically with regards to robotic surgery. So fidelity is obviously the realism of, say, for example, a mannequin. There's a lot of 3G mannequins that provide that realistic. You can insert drugs into them. You can get the parameters back on a screen and things like that. And there's a common sort of misconception that fidelity and authenticity combine together. Authenticity is the actual learning. So how authentic is the learning? So undertaking any learning on anything other than the robot, it could be argued, would not provide any benefit. So explaining how the robot arms move is not going to be as useful as actually grabbing hold of the robot and moving the arms. And obviously that's extremely difficult because of the access to the robot. One of the other comparisons I want to make is this aviation versus medicine. And I think the robot is unique in this element. There's a lot of people who've sort of removed this argument that it's very simple for pilots to go into a simulator and replicate a plane. You have a left engine failure and that plane will react in a certain way each time. It's got characteristics. It's like a sports car. You put your foot down in a Ferrari and it's going to take off. If you're in a Skoda or something of less performance, then it's not going to go as fast. And they can replicate exactly what the reactions are and test pilots in that way. And obviously from a medical perspective and a clinical perspective, it's far more difficult because patients have an infinite amount of physiological parameters and you can't gauge how that patient is going to react. Now, I think the robot introduces that element of mechanical anticipation. So you've got you remove yourself from the fidelity of the patient when we're training in simulation and examine how we work with the robot. Because we can train to look after patients in normal simulation sessions, in basic life support, advanced life support, and use the advanced mannequins. And that's where the sort of the fidelity argument falls a little bit. But with regards to the fidelity and the authenticity of the robot, we can use the robot and it will react in a certain way. The arms move in a certain way. You will have to remove the robot in a certain way. And we can use that to develop ourselves for when we're looking at training. One example of that is a pit stop. So, for example, a Formula 1 team will practice over and over and over again at a pit stop, and they will reduce that time down to seconds. We can potentially introduce that into robotic surgery so that we're not looking necessarily directly at performing the intervention to the patient, but we're looking at getting the robot off in a quick manner. And there was a lot of observations that are made from my simulations, which I'll go on to. So my simulation, the aim of the project was to understand how the implementation of an emergency robotic simulation contributed to non-technical skills. And it's varied and adapted as I've gone along. It looked at the practitioner experience and it looked at de-docking speeds. So the setup was in our robotic theatre. It was in Leeds. We set up the robot with a trainer, and it was a very basic trainer, just a box trainer. There's no element of surgery being undertaken. There was no need to simulate the surgery being undertaken, because the idea was about how we work with the robot and how the team worked with the robot. The sample was extremely small because I didn't have a lot of time. I had to undertake it on an audit morning, so it was a purposive sample of 7 practitioners. Unfortunately, we couldn't do it in a multidisciplinary element because there was no availability of surgeons. And these are some of the struggles that are obviously difficult about education and simulations, specifically within robotic surgery. There were 3 scenarios that we undertook. It was a major hemorrhage, a cardiac arrest, and an anaesthetic issue. So the tube came out. The one that I want to point out, I'll come back to that point. It was a quasi-experimental design. It was a single group design. Okay, so there's the number of sort of elements with internal validity there. We repeated the 3 simulations twice, so there's the learning curve element. Naturally, people are going to develop on the second time round. Non-technical skills was measured via the OTAS tool, as Rebecca did. Again, this is not specifically used for simulation. It's not validated for simulation, so there are some elements there. We timed the simulations, and then we provided an 11-question semi-structured questionnaire about the practitioner's experience. With regards to non-technical skills, we performed a one-way and over on the figures that we'd taken, and there was an improvement in non-technical skills. With regards to the anaesthetic issue, the time to removal of the DDoC time on the robot reduced by 22%, and with the major hemorrhage, it reduced by 50%. Unfortunately, the cardiac arrest had to be omitted because on the second run of the simulation, someone had left the crash trolley outside the door, not in its original place. So it reduced it significantly, but that was because the first time someone had run to recovery, and the second time someone had put the hand outside door and rolled the crash trolley in. So we had to omit that that one. Just some of the observations from the thematic analysis. I did a thematic analysis on the questionnaires that were provided. A lot of the practitioners outlined anxiety about not just about working with the robot, but the actual mechanics of the robot, and not knowing how to move it and things like that. And I'll explain just some of my personal observations as I get to the end of this. Collaboration, there was everybody outlined that there was a need for collaboration between the team as a whole. It wasn't a case of as compared to sort of laparoscopic and open, you're in a bit of a bubble. There's everybody who's required to be there, certainly with regards to a major hemorrhage or opening the abdomen. The environment, again, the environment's sort of enclosed. There's the bulk of the robot. There's far more equipment around. You've got to usually walk around the theatre. So there's far more things to be involved in there. The other element was the simulation environment. There was a lot of anxiety about actually undertaking a simulation. People watching it was filmed, so there was quite a lot of anxiety there with regards to their performance. Patient care, again, this sort of fed back to the size of the robot and the overarching element of it. And confidence. Prior to the simulation, a lot of people outlined that they weren't confident, and after there was a sort of an improvement in confidence. It was sort of on a basic level, but there were a lot of observations that I took from it. And one point I just wanted to make, because there's a lot of discussion about the surgical first assistant and the assistant. And it was the major hemorrhage one that really opened my eyes. We undertook the major hemorrhage simulation, and the times that we undertook was from the initial sort of realisation of a major hemorrhage to the point that the surgeon was at the table with a knife in his hand. And we brought a slave stack in and played a video of a bleed and asked the scrub practitioner to act as they would in anticipating that and how they would react. At the table, there was a surgical first assistant and a scrub practitioner, and the consultant surgeon was at the robot station. When the bleed was recognised, the surgeon went to put a gown on, and the surgical first assistant stood and waited once they'd got the robot off, because he couldn't gain access to the abdomen because he wasn't trained to gain access. So if that was a major hemorrhage, as you pointed out, it's quite easy to go through the vena cava or the aorta. then that was valuable time wasted because everything was ready. The robot was off, the team worked in sort of harmony to get the robot off extremely quickly. But the surgical first assistant and the scrub practitioner, once that were then stood there. It was a small delay in time, but in comparison to the others, it was a delay in time. The other point I wanted to bring up about that was that there is a massive grey area about who can insert and remove instruments, and that often comes up. The curriculum for operating department practitioners now allows enhanced skills to be practiced. So, as they used to do the dual role, which is obviously not allowed now, shall we say, they can undertake retraction, indirect hemostasis, they can undertake prepping and draping and things like that. And I think there is an element, and there's certainly a gap, to introduce an element of education for inserting and removing robotic instruments, because then you would remove that gap, and then potentially remove that element of, if you have an inexperienced surgeon or first assistant, that the scrub practitioner is well within their boundaries to undertake that. And I think that needs to be potentially incorporated into an educational programme. Future considerations, I think obviously there's so many different angles to come from. There's a human factors angle, there's a simulation angle, there's the education angle to come from, and there's a lot of sort of further awareness to be raised, further collaboration to get people together to have these discussions. I think there's the potential for educational modules, certainly from a surgical first assistant point of view, certainly about integrating it into sort of nursing and operating department practice curriculums. There's the examination of technical and non-technical skills. As part of my master's project, I applied for the Team of the Year award for the people who worked with me from the AFPP Siobhan Rankin Team of the Year award, and we were successful. This was a £2,000 grant, and on the April bank holiday, we're running a collaborative away day where practitioners, surgeons, very similar to something like this, where we can have a discussion about robotic surgery and ways we can collaborate and take it forward. So if anybody's interested in that, please do come and speak to me. Thank you very much. Is there any questions?
Any questions?
Great. Answer them all.
I've got one.
All
I'm going to ask what I asked this morning was, again, I heard the word surgeon. Has the anaesthetist been involved in this team training as well?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the difficulty, I put the anaesthetic issue in.
Yeah, I know you did.
Because there was an element there. I think there was a real difficulty because it wasn't multidisciplinary. So when we did the results, we removed the surgeon and the anaesthetist and examined sort of the questionnaires, examined the team. And obviously that's a bit sort of contentious, but
exactly.
The reason we're to look at the team, I think there's so much potential to move forward in this. And I don't want to get, it doesn't have to be a high fidelity simulation like I did. It doesn't have to be like that. It could be a case of getting everybody in a room and putting the robot next to them and moving the arms together and saying, this is how the arm moves, this is how you stop the instrument doing what it did before, and just having a conversation. And the authenticity of using the robot means that you don't need to necessarily make it a high fidelity simulation. So there's lots of different angles it can come from.
The reason I ask that is that the anaesthetist will come from a different angle. He's not sitting behind the console, so his communication of alert will be different to what, so it needs to be built into that format. We talked about language and things today.
Thank you, Tracy. Arron, this was a bonus for me. I hadn't realised that this tiny little training, I wouldn't even call it a study, those training interventions we did at this DGH in years ago in Essex, on our spare time, I was going there for the fun of it, would actually give rise to something I'm delighted to see that they have. So just a bit of background, because I think it might be relevant. I think that one of the key the sort of the red threads that's bringing a lot of it together is how haphazard it all is. So we had sort of pledged that we would, turn up and undertake the team training until all the teams had undertaken the training, and it would actually a urology team and a colorectal team turned up. That was the entire team as they would operate normally. This was absolutely brilliant. Then the anaesthetist said, okay, well, we're going to make this a hybrid simulation because we want the anaesthetist and the ODPs to make more out of it. So we actually had a mannequin on the, I can't remember, it was a C-man or something like that. So effectively they were managing the crisis through their software. So it was a proper team simulation. Why did we only do 2? Because the trust couldn't get the other teams to attend. And we said, this is not costing any money in terms of hard cash. Of course it's costing money because everything costs money. But we're doing it for free effectively. And yet there was no formal way of actually getting these people together. And I think my view is that this is not acceptable. I mean, we heard earlier, would you want to be on a flight where people say, well, I'm really sorry, this year we didn't certify your pilots because we couldn't get them onto the simulator. Sorry, but next year we might. We don't do these things. I mean, the level of risk acceptance that we have for some of the technologies that we're using in healthcare, not just surgery, I think is shocking. But I also think that, and it might be a comment for our patient representative, how much of this is actually shared knowledge amongst the wider public? I don't think that people realize the level of if you like, making up as we go along attitude that we have in healthcare. When we did a study with patients, say for surgical checklists, the first question we got is, why are you studying this? Are people not doing this already? And I was shocked as a scientist to be asking that question at that point. But I think we really need to rethink some of the stuff that you're presenting. It's just dead obvious. Yes, healthcare is not like aviation. We've been arguing it for a while. But in fact, the robot is quite predictable. So not getting people to put in and out the arm about 1 million times until they can do it with their eyes closed, I think to me is a shocking reality. We shouldn't be putting up with that. Thank you.
One last, we've got 2 more questions.
All I could just say as the patient representative, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think people would be absolutely horrified if they knew. And in fact, they wouldn't believe it. I think that would be the problem. They simply wouldn't believe what you've just heard here. They'd say, well, I can't be right. Oh, that can't happen. These people paid all these fortunes of money, these surgeons. They couldn't allow this to happen, could they?
I think just to add to that point, I think it's that sort of element of the skill mix that's involved. Another example within one of the simulations, and it was the very first simulation I ran, the scrub practitioner didn't know how to take the robot off. So again, there was a point where they were like, and because it was a simulation, it almost stopped. They stood there and went, I don't know what to do. But it was excellent. I was so glad that happened because it happened in my simulation, and it really raised a point that, our surgeons, our teams, aware of what people do and do not know when they're working in robotic surgery. So that's another element that I think it's a safe environment, and it's an important environment that we need to be sort of examining further.
I mean, I'm just going to say that the point you've made is if public was aware, they will be horrified. But it's a great privilege, I think, for the surgical, the overall medical and, sort of associated medical sort of community that public put a great deal of faith. And in fact, it surprised me. A couple of years ago, a patient said to me, I appreciate, you're telling me that you got about 6 weeks waiting time before you take my cancer out. I'm very happy if you, sort of forward me to another colleague of yours with a lesser time. And I said, yeah, I can certainly try that. And the other thing he said to me, which surprised me completely, was, he said to me, well, I believe all the surgeons are the same anyway, isn't it? And it puzzled me. I kind of, on one hand, I was trying to obviously very much help him, and I had kind of accepted that I'll discuss and see if any of my colleagues could do him a little earlier, because he was a very anxious man. But I had to kind of answer him, and I said to him, but I'm thinking about your sort of just a general remark. All the surgeons, consultants are the same. All the architects, engineers, the builders, all the same. And he goes, no. So I said, I think I've given you your answer. And it's very interesting is that immediately he said to me, no, I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to stay. So just going back to one other point, I think the lack of direct you can say, connection with the patient for the operating surgeon in robotic surgery, it probably is going to lead to some very significant medical legal issues in times to come. Because I think the first assistant who is with the patient has to be equivalent of an operating surgeon, because the time from a major bleed and the lead surgeon to scrub and to open could be a loss of vital few minutes, and in that time an experienced first assistant could have just put a bit of pressure with an instrument, a swab. So I think it's going to have its own implications, which will be very different to what we are used to in open or conventional laparoscopic surgery.
I'm sorry, dear, about time. Are you happy to, if we grab coffees now, and so we can get our eminent panel up here? I'm sure your question can be directed to them at that point. Is that okay? Thanks. So if you all grab a coffee and come back to your seats. Can we thank the speakers from this afternoon as well?